At long last, it seems the day has finally come. Canada's getting its first ever high-speed rail network. This multi-billion-dollar project poses numerous potential benefits for multiple provinces in the country. Beyond enhancing transportation and connectivity for a huge portion of Canada's 40 million people, the rail network also promises environmental benefits and a major boost to the country's unsteady economy. It'll be the largest infrastructure project in Canada's history, offering a bright light on the horizon to a country currently swept up in the uncertainty of a volatile international trade climate. But it hasn't come without controversy, nor has it come easily. Tonight, we'll take a look at the nuts and bolts of this exciting megaproject and how it could revolutionize Canadian society from Toronto to Quebec City. We'll also explore the fascinating history behind Canada's prolonged struggles with high-speed rail and the rather sensitive subject of why it currently remains the only G7 country without one. Canada has named their upcoming high-speed rail project Alto, a name shared by the state-owned corporation in charge of the project. It was announced by Justin Trudeau on February 19, 2025, roughly 1 month after he announced his resignation as Prime Minister. Arguably the last major policy initiative of Trudeau's tenure, it's also easily one of the most significant. While Canadian citizens had known since November 2022 that a high-speed rail project was being discussed, until that fateful February 2025 announcement, they had known virtually nothing about it. The announcement came swiftly and suddenly, and many were unprepared for the scale and ambition of the project now being unveiled. Trudeau's description of the project was quite matter-of-fact. It would be, quote, the largest infrastructure project in Canadian history. He wasn't kidding. Alto is set to entail roughly 1,000 kilometers of track, stretching from Quebec City to Toronto. This stretch of Canada, known as the Quebec City-Windsor Corridor, is the most populous region in the country and the most heavily industrialized. Approximately 18 million people live within the corridor, and the proposed line will directly serve cities where a total of 13 million people currently live. The trains will travel at a top speed of 300 kilometers per hour, or 186 miles an hour, nearly doubling the top speed of Canada's current fastest train. Currently, those seeking to travel from Quebec City to Toronto are faced with a nearly 8-hour drive, or a 9-hour train ride. Alto will cut that time to a fraction of its former self, with the journey from Quebec City to Toronto projected to take just 3 hours. All of this was exciting enough to hear the Prime Minister announce on national television, but the most attention-grabbing part of the announcement came when Mr. Trudeau revealed the price tag. The Canadian government had already committed 3.9 billion Canadian dollars, or about 2.7 billion US dollars, just for the design and planning phase, before a single inch of track would even be laid down. It was later revealed that the full project, which is expected to take 4 to 5 years to complete, will ultimately cost anywhere from 80 billion to 120 billion Canadian dollars. No project in the history of Canada has even come close to such an astronomical cost. In fact, the current record holder was also the work of the Trudeau government. In 2018, Canada purchased the Trans Mountain Pipeline from Kinder Morgan for 4.5 billion Canadian dollars, then embarked on a still ongoing expansion project that's racked up a total cost of $34 billion. To call that project controversial would be an understatement. From widespread concerns about environmental impacts to concerns over Indigenous rights, and even to concerns over its legality, the Trans Mountain Pipeline project would have rocked the boat even without its exorbitant price. It was in the wake of this ongoing controversy that Alto was then announced, a project declared right from the start to be at least 2 to 3 times more expensive. Needless to say, this raised some concerns, and we'll return to those in more detail soon enough. But in the immediate wake of the unveiling of this monster price tag, onlookers in Canada and around the world didn't have much time to think about dollars before being swept away by the potential transformations to Canadian society that are now, at long last, on offer. Alto is planned to have 7 major stations, from north to south. The line will cover Quebec City, Trois-Rivières, Laval, Montreal, Ottawa, Peterborough, and finally Toronto. Of the 6 journeys between these stations, 4 are projected to be faster than even air travel when factoring in total time spent. All 6 journeys are also projected to nearly double, or more than double, the speed of driving or existing railways. To reduce delays and enhance reliability, the passenger rails and freight rails will be completely separated from each other. The entire corridor will also be fully electrified, which means the rail line is projected to have a large-scale positive environmental impact on everything. Specific architectural plans for the individual stations still haven't been announced, but major urban centers like Toronto and Montreal are likely to use existing transportation hubs. Union Station in Toronto is currently undergoing a large enhancement project, so it's possible that Alto will utilize the newly enhanced station along its 1,000-kilometer route. A study by the C.D. Howe Institute found that over 6 decades, the rail line could generate between 15 and 27 billion Canadian dollars of value for citizens in the area, and that the number of people served by the rail line could eventually rise to more than 43 million. But if transforming the most populous region of Canada with high-speed rail were that simple, the truth is, the country would have done it a long time ago. Many remain wary of putting their faith in this new project, and when you glance at the history of high-speed rail in Canada, you begin to see why. The first murmurings about high-speed rail in Canada date all the way back to the 1960s. That was when the Canadian National Railway introduced something called the UAC TurboTrain. Built in the United States by the United Aircraft Corporation, these were gas turbine trains which featured technologies that were advanced for their time, including articulated cars and passive tilting. Best of all, they were blisteringly fast by 1960 standards. In a 1967 test run in New Jersey, the train hit 170 miles an hour. But in a subsequent test run held in Canada in 1976, the train maxed out at only 140 miles an hour. This was not the only issue the train would eventually face in Canada. It also struggled with reliability issues, and because the system had been designed to share tracks between the TurboTrain and freight services, the TurboTrain was even further constrained. Canadian journalists also gave the experience of riding the TurboTrain poor reviews, citing sharp jerks during turns and excessively loud rail noise. All of this combined to limit actual passenger travel to just 100 miles an hour. Still faster than driving, but admittedly quite a disappointment nonetheless. After its initial launch in 1968, the TurboTrain was retired in 1982 by the Canadian authorities. Few would have expected the 1960s to be the peak of high-speed transportation in Canada. But surprisingly, to this day, the TurboTrain holds the Canadian speed record, nearly 50 years after it was set. Over the decades that followed, numerous studies were done that demonstrated just how transformative a new high-speed rail project would be for Canada's most populous areas. It became a familiar talking point among Canadian politicians as well. But as the world moved into the 21st century, and as other first world nations throughout Europe started operating high-speed rail systems while countries like Japan and China expanded theirs into futuristic territory, Canada remained conspicuously absent on the list. In 2003, when the United Kingdom introduced the HS1 line to the Channel Tunnel, Canada became the only G7 country without any high-speed trains. Even the United States, a country frequently bemoaned for its inadequate public transportation, is home to the fastest train in the Americas, the Acela, which carries millions of passengers each year from Boston all the way to Washington, D.C. at a top speed of 150 miles per hour. The fastest train in Canada, meanwhile, tops out at just 100. This isn't surprising when one looks at the history of investment. Despite studying the subject extensively and discussing it at the podium frequently, Canada's consistently had the lowest per capita rail investment of any G7 country for the last 3 decades and running. It wasn't until 2021 that the Ontario-based construction company Elliston announced a partnership with American infrastructure firm Aecon to build a truly modern, high-tech bullet train from Calgary to Edmonton at a projected cost of 9 billion Canadian dollars. The journey's only 3 hours by bus, so the project lacked the full-scale transformative appeal of a nationwide transportation upgrade. But it was a start. Better yet, the proposed speed for the train was surprisingly high, 250 miles an hour at full sprint, rivaling the world's fastest in China. The project was given the name Prairie Link, and it marked the first tangible step toward Canadian high-speed rail in decades. However, the project faced some obstacles, one being that 100% of its funding was going to come from the private sector. That wasn't a strategic choice, it was a necessity. Back in 2014, the Legislative Assembly of Alberta issued a report declaring that the government should not invest in a new transit system. The director of Prairie Link, Jeffrey Hansen Carlson, was quoted when the project was announced, saying, "On a project this complex, it's never as easy as taking the population, estimating how many people are going to ride the train, and then multiplying that by the ticket price. It would seem, however, that the Alberta government did not, and does not even to this day, agree. As of the time of this video, Prairie Link remains in the planning and development stage. Although a $9 million budget was allocated in April 2024 for a comprehensive study that hopes to approve the rail line, or at least move it along to the next bureaucratic step, by the summer of 2025. It's far from impossible that Prairie Link will eventually get built, but the wider reality is that both it and the decades that preceded it have made Canadian citizens cynical about the prospect of ever actually riding a bullet train in their country. The grand scale of Alto is something few could resist noticing. Forget high-speed rail. No infrastructure project of any kind can rival it in Canadian history. But does that mean it'll be the one that finally breaks through and succeeds? Or will it be another frustrating chapter in the nation's troubled quest for high-speed rail? There are plenty of reasons for skepticism, from politicians making big promises to billions spent on studies and feasibility reports with no actual tracks laid down for decades and running. But there are some reasons to be hopeful, too. For one, there are different ways to interpret the historic level of funding. A cynic might say it just makes the project even less likely to get off the ground, but it also demonstrates a level of commitment the Canadian government has never made before. The funding also hasn't come out of thin air. The project's backed by a large international consortium called Cadence, which brings together the expertise and operational experience of several high-profile companies in Canada and Europe. Also, unlike other projects in the past, Alto's no longer just a study. It's a federally backed crown corporation with a mandate to deliver. That's why the Prime Minister of the country announced it on national television and generated far-reaching headlines. It's also worth considering how public appetites have changed. There's arguably never been more support for green infrastructure, and while controversy may surround some of Canada's other recent projects and some of the costs, consensus seems overwhelming that Alto is a good idea, and that it would have a massively positive impact not only on Canadian life, but also on the environment. Whatever the odds, Canada's up against some significantly high stakes. It's been the only G7 country without a high-speed rail system for more than 2 decades now. Critics say the country is overly reliant on cars and air travel, and that its mobility is inadequately future-proof. Bringing Alto to life would change all of that. Canada would not only join the other G7 countries, but immediately enter the upper echelon. Alto would be the fastest train in the Americas, beating out the United States Acela train by tens of miles per hour. Domestic life could change dramatically for tens of millions of Canadians, not to mention international business and tourism. The change in how cities connect could have an impact on economic integration, political cohesion, and even equity between regions. We may see a spike in growth across several cities in Canada, including some which are already growing, like Toronto, if Alto gets built and becomes fully operational. But the reality is, construction hasn't started. Costs might balloon even more. Governments change. Priorities shift. This project is still far from guaranteed. What can be said at this stage is that it's by far the biggest leap forward in the history of Canadian high-speed rail. And if any project has a shot at bestowing the nation with the long overdue benefits it has sought for decades, Alto is it.